The palace of Emperor Caligula was not a place of politics, it was a shrine to madness. The marble halls that once echoed with the voices of Rome's greatest senators now trembled beneath screams muffled by gold and incense. In those corridors, beauty was currency, innocence was a debt, and no one, not daughter, wife, or priest, was ever safe from the emperor's gaze. They said he could command storms, that Jupiter himself whispered in his ear after his fever, and that the gods had chosen him as the living face of desire and punishment. But what the gods never demanded, Caligula created. Behind the silk curtains of his private chambers, rituals began that blurred the line between worship and horror. Rome's noble bloodline became the emperor's personal experiment, a theater of cruelty where every sin was rebranded as divine service. Fathers offered daughters not out of loyalty, but to survive. Husbands bowed their heads while their wives were displayed like trophies. And every atrocity, every act, too monstrous to imagine, was recorded, stamped, and sealed in the archives of an empire that had forgotten its own humanity. This was how divinity became depravity. Before the palace walls dripped with sin, before Rome learned to whisper his name in fear. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus was the empire's most cherished son. They called him Caligula, Little Boots, a nickname from the soldiers who adored him as the child mascot of his father's legions. In those early years, his laughter echoed through military camps, and his presence was believed to bring victory. The legions would lift him onto their shields, cheering as if the gods themselves had chosen him to inherit Rome's destiny. The people loved him not as an emperor, but as a promise, the living heir to Germanicus, a warrior whose honor and valor had defined an age. When the old emperor Tiberius died and Caligula ascended the throne, the city erupted in celebration. For the first time in years, Rome exhaled. The Senate, once strangled by paranoia, found courage again. Citizens flooded the streets, scattering petals and lighting torches. They believed the age of cruelty had ended. What they did not know was that the boy in the soldier's boots had walked through hell before he ever wore the crown. Caligula's childhood had been a lesson in fear. His father, Germanicus, had been poisoned, murdered under the shadow of imperial suspicion. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was exiled. His brothers were executed one by one. The young Caligula learned that affection was fatal, that trust was a death sentence, and that survival depended on performance. In the palace of Tiberius, he mastered the art of pretending, smiling when he wanted to scream, obeying when he wanted to kill, playing the fool to avoid the executioner's blade. He spent years watching men die for glances, words, or rumors. He memorized every mask his enemies wore and every weakness they exposed. By the time he inherited the empire, he was not a boy, he was a mirror of everything Rome had done to him. Beneath his charm, there was rot, carefully preserved behind a smile that could soothe or destroy. When he took the throne in 37 CE, his rule began like a dream. He abolished taxes, freed political prisoners, and organized grand games that filled the Colosseum with joy. His generosity seemed divine, his charisma magnetic. The same senators who had once lived in terror now toasted his name. Women threw flowers in his path, men wept in gratitude. For a brief moment, the empire believed it had been reborn under a merciful God. But mercy was only the mask. Within months, a sickness struck, an illness so severe that the court physicians declared his survival impossible. For days, he drifted between fever and hallucination, muttering about Jupiter calling to him from the storm. Rome prayed and sacrificed animals in every temple, desperate to save the emperor they adored. And then, one morning, he awoke. The doctors called it a miracle, the priests called it divine favor, but those who saw him that day said his eyes were not the same. The warmth had vanished. What looked back at them was something cold, calculating, and hungry. From that moment, everything changed. The reforms stopped. The laughter faded. He began ordering strange statues of himself wearing the crowns of gods. Temples were stripped of their idols and refitted with his image. Those who hesitated were executed for treason against divinity. Night after night, the emperor wandered his palace sleepless, whispering to invisible voices, holding conversations with the moon. Servants claimed he could be heard laughing alone in the dark, muttering that he had seen Jupiter's throne and stolen his power. By the time the senators realized what had awakened in him, it was already too late. Caligula was no longer the savior Rome had prayed for. He was the reflection of its own corruption, the divine monster it had unknowingly created. What began as whispers of divine madness soon hardened into policy. Caligula no longer saw himself as emperor, he saw himself as God incarnate, Jupiter reborn in human flesh, sent to rewire Rome through fear and submission. In his mind, every act of indulgence was a sacred rite, every humiliation an offering to his divinity. The marble corridors of the Palatine Hill became laboratories of corruption, where sacred ceremony, political obedience, and personal cruelty fused into one seamless machine. What had once been the seat of Roman law transformed into a theater of sanctified depravity. The first to feel its weight were those closest to him, his own blood. His sisters, Drusilla, Julia Livilla, and Agrippina the Younger, were elevated publicly to the rank of priestesses of a new divine cult centered entirely around him. The Roman people were told to honor them as living embodiments of purity, yet behind closed doors the emperor turned that title into a weapon. To defy his appetite was treason, to accept it was salvation. The lines between love, worship, and horror disappeared entirely within the walls of his palace. Drusilla became the center of his obsession. He called her his Diana, his divine consort, his equal in both heaven and earth. During ceremonies, he had her seated beside him in places once reserved for imperial wives. She wore golden wreaths, veils of white silk, and amulets carved with the image of the moon goddess. But these rituals were not born from affection. They were manifestations of possession. When she died suddenly in 38 CE, something inside Caligula tore open. He ordered a mourning period so severe that laughter was outlawed. Rome was forbidden from singing, bathing, or attending public feasts. Statues were draped in black, and the Senate was forced to declare her a goddess. The grief that poured from Caligula was not love. It was fury that death had stolen what he believed belonged to him alone. From that moment, he began to believe that he alone could control not only life and death, but the sanctity of human bodies. The emperor's palace was redesigned to reflect his transformation. Chambers that once hosted meetings of state were reimagined as sacred halls of divine service. One room was renamed the Temple of Jupiter, where Caligula enacted rituals he claimed were offerings to the gods. In truth, they were orchestrated acts of degradation, performances in which noble men and women were forced to reenact scenes from Roman mythology, while the emperor watched from a gilded throne. Another chamber was called the Room of Venus, decorated with frescoes of divine unions, where noblewomen and the daughters of senators were forced into what the emperor termed rites of fertility. These ceremonies were mandatory, justified by decrees that claimed Rome's prosperity depended on them. The Senate, too terrified to resist, drafted laws that cloaked his crimes in religious sanctity. Every command from the emperor's mouth became scripture, every act a holy precedent. The horrors grew more systematic as his confidence deepened. Priests, scribes, and attendants were assigned roles in his new cult. There were record keepers to document every participant, physicians to certify their fitness, and accountants to manage the funds that poured in under the guise of temple donations. Even humiliation was categorized and scheduled. Some ceremonies took place under the full moon, which Caligula claimed symbolized renewal, others under torchlight, which he said pleased Mars, the god of war. It was bureaucracy weaponized for blasphemy, an organized theology of pain. The empire that once worshipped law now bowed to one man's delirium, because that delirium had been made official. The rituals had begun, and through them Caligula turned the Roman state into an altar of terror where worship and violation became indistinguishable. Once the rituals were established, Caligula began to perfect them into a system. What had started as unrestrained madness evolved into an organized institution, meticulously recorded and ruthlessly enforced. Every act, every victim, every coin exchanged within the palace's walls became a transaction in what he called divine service. The imperial treasury began to swell with what official ledgers described as contributions to the sacred order. In reality, they were the proceeds of humiliation, forced from Rome's elite who paid to survive the emperor's notice. The Senate, trapped in complicity, allowed these transactions to be legalized under religious edicts that declared the emperor's will as an extension of the god's command. And so, the empire's most perverse administration was born, a bureaucratic nightmare where depravity was documented like taxation, and morality was erased with a signature. The records were kept in a sealed archive beneath the Palatine Palace, guarded by imperial scribes and soldiers sworn to silence. Each entry followed a rigid format: the victim's name, social status, physical attributes, the nature of the act, duration, witnesses, resulting injuries, pregnancies, and fees paid. Physicians were compelled to provide assessments of viability, determining which victims could be used again. Midwives were summoned to record births resulting from these forced rituals, while accountants balanced the profits that flowed directly into the emperor's coffers. The entire operation was disguised as a state program, its documents sealed with imperial insignia, its chambers referred to as temples, its participants listed as acolytes. This mechanical precision gave the horror a kind of legitimacy, as if atrocity could be sanctified through paperwork. Those who served within the system learned to detach themselves, to see victims not as people but as numbers and entries. No one felt guilt, because no one felt responsible. Caligula had discovered the perfect design, a cruelty without conscience, a machine that devoured souls while its operators convinced themselves they were merely performing their duties. Within this apparatus, the roles of men and women were redefined. Noble women became the centerpiece of his rituals, their bodies used as political instruments. Daughters of senators were evaluated for beauty and fertility, assigned prices that reflected their lineage. Husbands were ordered to sign contracts consenting to their wives' participation in divine union. Fathers were summoned to negotiate the fates of their daughters under the illusion of privilege. Those who resisted faced disappearance, and their families were erased from the records of Rome. But Caligula's cruelty extended beyond physical violation. It was psychological warfare. He forced senators to witness these ceremonies, to applaud while their own bloodlines were defiled, to thank him for the honor of service. He taught Rome that virtue was weakness and obedience was survival. And the longer the system ran, the easier it became for everyone to accept it as normal. Rome's greatest families began to mirror their emperor's corruption, offering their own flesh in exchange for influence and safety. What had once been outrage turned to habit. Even the empire's religious institutions fell into his orbit. Temples began to include prayers in the emperor's name, priests delivered blessings that sanctified the perverse rituals, poets composed hymns describing Caligula as the father of life and desire. Those who refused were publicly disgraced, their temples desecrated, their followers scattered. The machinery of depravity had consumed everything: law, religion, family, and dignity. It no longer needed the emperor's hand in every act. It functioned on its own momentum, powered by fear, greed, and submission. Caligula had built not merely a kingdom of cruelty, but a self-sustaining empire of corruption, one where suffering became spectacle, obedience became faith, and sin was transformed into governance. As Caligula's reign deepened, the rituals grew darker, their ceremony shifting from mere violation to deliberate desecration. The emperor began declaring that Rome's prosperity depended upon sacrifices of pleasure and pain, acts that would appease the gods and ensure the empire's eternal strength. These were not sacrifices in the traditional sense. They were orchestrated spectacles of degradation that blurred the boundary between religion and theater. On nights when the moon hung full and silver over the Palatine Hill, torches were lit across the palace courtyards, transforming marble into flame and shadow. Senators, noblemen, and their families were summoned without warning to attend what the emperor called lunar offerings. Attendance was not a privilege but a sentence, for none could refuse the invitation of a living god. Those who arrived found the palace transformed into a stage of madness. Perfumed smoke filled the air. Musicians played slow rhythms of drums and flutes, and from the upper galleries Caligula watched, draped in gold and crimson, a diadem upon his head, his expression fixed somewhere between ecstasy and cruelty. He would begin by invoking Jupiter, Venus, and Mars, calling upon them as his equals, not his superiors. Then, with the swing of a scepter carved from ivory and topped with a serpent of gold, he would signal the beginning of the rites. Gladiators, slaves, captives, and noble participants were forced into choreographed performances that imitated divine unions and mythological tales. Sometimes animals were brought in, lions, leopards, and massive black bulls, symbols of raw power forced into Caligula's blasphemous theater. Women were adorned like goddesses, their bodies painted in oils and dusted with gold. Men were stripped of their honor and reduced to ornaments in his divine carnival. The audience, composed of the very men who governed the empire, sat in silence, their faces masks of obedience while their souls screamed. To show disgust was death, to show joy was survival. The emperor laughed and applauded, tossing coins into the air like blessings from Olympus, as if his cruelty were art and his victims actors in a cosmic play. Behind these performances, an even deeper horror unfolded. Caligula began a breeding program disguised as a divine experiment. The women he judged most fertile were kept within the palace walls, forced into unions chosen by the emperor himself. The offspring of these rituals were considered sacred children, destined to serve the imperial cult. Many were never seen again. Physicians and scribes tracked every conception, every miscarriage, every infant death, recording them with the same precision as census data. It was the empire's most blasphemous innovation, turning human reproduction into a ritual of obedience. To deny participation was heresy. To fail to conceive was treason. Rome's aristocracy, once proud of its heritage, now lived in constant terror that their names would appear on the emperor's list of offerings. What made this system unbreakable was its illusion of holiness. Caligula cloaked every atrocity in the language of divine order. He claimed that suffering was purification, that pain brought Rome closer to eternity. The Senate, already broken by fear, ratified his decrees, giving legality to his madness. Even the Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite soldiers sworn to protect, became instruments of enforcement, dragging victims from their homes, escorting them through the marble corridors to the so-called temples of service. Every scream that echoed through those halls became another prayer in the emperor's religion of horror. The marble floors were scrubbed daily, the incense renewed, the frescoes repainted, but nothing could hide the truth. Rome's heart was rotting from within. The city that once conquered nations now bowed before one man's disease, offering its body and soul to a god who demanded blood in exchange for peace. And each night, as the torches burned down to their final embers, Caligula would whisper to the darkness that the gods were pleased, because in his mind he had finally surpassed them. By the final years of his reign, Caligula had ceased to resemble anything human. The emperor who once captivated Rome with his smile now drifted through his palace like a specter wrapped in purple silk, muttering to invisible gods and addressing statues as equals. He had converted his own madness into law, his desires into doctrine, and his violence into ritual. The empire beneath him no longer breathed freely. It gasped, suffocating under the weight of his divinity. The senators who had once bowed in admiration now did so only in terror, for every audience with the emperor was a gamble with death. One misplaced word could condemn a man's family. One nervous glance could erase an entire lineage from Roman record. Caligula's nights became endless processions of cruelty disguised as ceremony. He would summon guests to lavish feasts, only to turn the gatherings into scenes of terror, demanding the wives of his ministers as sacred companions, mocking the gods with blasphemous prayers, and forcing laughter at what he called the comedy of mortals. The palace had become a world of its own, sealed off from reality, a labyrinth of perfumed halls and shrines built from fear. It was within this labyrinth that resistance began to whisper. Among the Praetorian Guard, those once sworn to protect him, resentment simmered beneath the armor. The soldiers had become both witnesses and instruments of the emperor's debauchery, forced to guard chambers where screams never ceased, ordered to deliver victims as if offering tributes to Olympus. Their loyalty had been purchased through gold and terror, but humiliation corrodes all allegiances. Cassius Chaerea, a seasoned officer and one of the emperor's favorites to mock, became the blade of destiny. Caligula ridiculed his voice, called him a woman in public, and forced him to perform degrading tasks during ceremonies. Each insult carved deeper into Chaerea's pride, until resentment hardened into resolve. He began to gather men who had seen too much, guards who had carried out atrocities, senators who had lost wives and daughters, scribes who could no longer endure writing the unwritable. They were not conspirators in pursuit of justice, but desperate souls seeking deliverance from the abyss their own hands had helped build. On the night of January 24, 41 CE, Caligula prepared what he claimed would be the grandest of all ceremonies, a spectacle to mark his deification before the empire. The marble halls glowed with torchlight, the air thick with incense and the scent of fear. Senators and their families assembled in forced reverence as the emperor appeared in full regalia, wearing a golden breastplate and a crown shaped like the sun. He spoke of ascending beyond mortality, of merging with Jupiter himself, and ordered that the next day the entire city should witness his divine union in the theater. But before dawn, as he walked through an underground passage leading from the palace to the amphitheater, the gods he had invoked turned silent. Out of the shadows, Sharia and his men emerged. Their swords flashed in the dim torchlight. The first strike cut through his shoulder, the next pierced his ribs, the third split his jaw. The emperor staggered, trying to speak, but his voice dissolved into gurgled laughter. They stabbed him again and again, 30 wounds and more, until the marble floor drank the blood of the man who thought himself immortal. One soldier delivered the final blow between his legs, a symbolic act meant to destroy the source of his desecration. When the body was found, chaos erupted. His wife and infant daughter were executed to erase the bloodline, and the Senate rushed to cleanse the empire of his memory. Statues were torn down, inscriptions were chiseled away, and coins bearing his face were melted into anonymity. Yet the system he built did not vanish with his corpse. The archives remained, the scribes continued to serve, and the laws he enacted still echoed in the machinery of governance. Rome pretended to forget, but its soul remembered. In every silent household that had once been forced to applaud him, in every mother who avoided her child's eyes, in every senator who signed decrees with trembling hands, his presence lingered. Caligula had proven that power can sanctify even horror if clothed in ceremony, and that once a god is born in the mind of man, his death never ends him. It only transfers his madness to those who survive. And so, when history speaks of Caligula's death, it does not whisper relief but warning. His empire may have fallen, his body may have turned to dust, but the system he perfected, the bureaucratized cruelty, the worship of dominance, the erasure of empathy still survives wherever power is worshipped as sacred. It lives in the archives of every tyranny, in the shadows of every state that values obedience over conscience. The lesson of Caligula is eternal. The gods we invent to rule over others are always the monsters we build within ourselves. If you've stayed with this descent into the darkest corridors of Rome, remember that history repeats not by accident, but by design. To uncover more of what empires try to bury and to keep these truths alive, make sure you like, subscribe, and join us for the next chapter of the world's forbidden history.